Meanwhile, the Trinidad, which had been left behind in the Moluccas, attempted to sail back to Panama. They sailed as far north as 43 degrees, around longitude 175 degrees west. Unfortunately, they ran out of provisions and had to return to the Moluccas. Upon their return, they were captured by a fleet of Portuguese vessels that was sent to prevent the Spaniards from interfering with the Portuguese monopoly on the spice trade. The Trinidad's crew was taken prisoner, and only 4 of them made it back to Spain after many adventures. 13 others who had landed at the Cape Verde Islands from the Victoria may also be counted among the survivors of the fleet. In total, only 35 out of 270 sailors survived the voyage, making them the first circumnavigators of the globe. This voyage was of unique importance in terms of geographical discovery. It confirmed the existence of an entirely new world that was independent from Asia. The Trinidad's backward voyage, which has rarely been noticed, showed that there was a wide expanse of ocean north of the line and east of Asia. The previous voyage had already shown the enormous extent of sea south of the line. After the Victoria's circumnavigation, cosmographers realized that the world was much larger than the ancients had imagined. Alternatively, one could say that Asia was smaller than medieval writers had thought. Magalhães' dogged persistence in carrying out his idea, which turned out to be perfectly justifiable, raises him to a greater height than Columbus, whose month-long voyage brought him exactly where he thought he would find land according to Toscanelli's map. After Magellan, the whole coastlines of the world were roughly known, except for the Arctic Circle and Australia. The emperor was overjoyed with the outcome of the voyage. He bestowed upon Del Cano a pension and a coat of arms to commemorate his service. The terms of the grant are quite significant: 2 crossed cinnamon sticks, 3 nutmegs, and 12 cloves on a red background with a gold castle on top. The crest is a globe with the motto, "Thou wert the first to go round me." The supporters are 2 crowned Malay kings holding a branch of spices. The castle symbolizes Castile, but the rest of the emblem highlights the importance of the voyage, particularly the visit to the Spice Islands. However, as previously mentioned, the Portuguese regained control of the Moluccas immediately after the Victoria's departure, and 7 years later, Charles V relinquished any claims he may have had through Magellan's visit. Nevertheless, for a long time, the Spaniards still coveted the Spice Islands, and the Fuggers, the powerful bankers of Augsburg who financed the Spanish monarch, attempted to gain control of Peru to use it as a jumping place for a new endeavor to acquire the Moluccas. In the great saga of the New World's discovery and delimitation, we can discern 3 distinct stages. First, Columbus, in his initial foray, believed he had arrived at Zipangu, or Japan, and accomplished his mission. Second, Amerigo Vespucci, by navigating down the South American coast, revealed the existence of a vast, uncharted landmass that lay between Columbus's discoveries and the coveted Spice Islands. Third, Magellan confirmed this notion by crossing the southern Pacific for thousands of miles before arriving at the Moluccas. There exists a 4th stage, wherein it was gradually revealed that the northwest of America did not adjoin Asia. This stage was only gradually attained and ultimately determined by the voyages of Bering and Cook. Chapter 8. To the Indies, the English, French, Dutch, and Russian routes. The discovery of the New World had profound consequences on the relative importance of the different nations of Europe. For over 2,000 years, the chief centers had been around the shores of the Mediterranean. Venice, with her central position and extensive trade to the east, had become a world center during the latter Middle Ages. However, after Columbus, and even more so, after Magellan, the European nations on the Atlantic were found to be closer to the New World and, in a sense, closer to the Spice Islands, which they could reach entirely by ship, instead of having to pay expensive land freights. The trade routes through Germany were immediately neglected, and only in the present century has she at all recovered from the blow given to her by the discovery of the new sea routes in which she could not join. But to England, France, and the Low Countries, the new outlook promised a share in the world's trade and affairs generally, which they had never before possessed while the Mediterranean was the center of commerce. If the Indies could be reached by sea, they were almost in as fortunate a position as Portugal or Spain. Almost as soon as the new routes were discovered, the northern nations attempted to utilize them, notwithstanding the Bull of Partition, which the French king laughed at, and the Protestant English and Dutch had no reason to respect. Within 3 years of the return of Columbus from his first voyage, Henry VII employed John Cabot, a Venetian settled in Bristol, with his 3 sons, to attempt the voyage to the Indies by the Northwest Passage. He appears to have rediscovered Newfoundland in 1497, and then, in the following year, failing to find a passage there, coasted down North America nearly as far as Florida. In 1534, Jacques Cartier examined the St. Lawrence River, and his discoveries were later followed up by Samuel de Champlain, who explored some of the Great Lakes near the St. Lawrence and established French rule in Canada, or Acadia, as it was then called. In the pursuit of the fabled riches of the Indies, the English set their sights on a northern passage, but this time they ventured eastward. Sebastian Cabot, who had been appointed Grand Pilot of England by Edward VI, led an expedition in 1553 under the command of Sir Hugh Willoughby. Only one ship, with the pilot Richard Chancellor aboard, survived the journey and made it to Archangel. Chancellor then travelled overland to Moscow, where he was warmly received by Ivan the Terrible, the Tsar of Russia. Unfortunately, Chancellor drowned on his return journey, and no further attempts to reach Cathay by sea were made. It seemed that the Northwest Passage held more promise than the Northeast, and in 1576 Martin Frobisher set off on an exploratory voyage. Before departing, Frobisher had the honour of receiving a wave from Elizabeth I as he passed Greenwich. He sailed to Greenland and then Labrador, where he discovered the strait that now bears his name. Sir Humphrey Gilbert, who had been granted the privilege of finding a passage to China and the Moluccas by the northwestward, northeastward, or northward route, took up Frobisher's project. Gilbert and his brother Adrian were also granted a patent to discover any lands unsettled by Christian princes. They established a settlement in St. John's, Newfoundland, but on the return voyage, Gilbert's frigate disappeared near the Azores. Before his ship went down, Gilbert was heard to shout, "Courage, my lads! We are as near heaven by sea as by land." This occurred in 1583. 2 years later, the merchants of London funded another expedition, this time under the leadership of John Davis. On this and 2 subsequent voyages, Davis discovered several passages trending westward, which gave hope that a northwest passage could be found. In addition to the strait that bears his name, Davis likely passed through the passage now named after Henry Hudson on his 3rd voyage in 1587. However, it would be another 20 years before Hudson was dispatched with a crew of 10 men and a boy in 1607. Hudson sailed to Spitzbergen and, in the following year, reached the North Magnetic Pole. 2 of his men were also lucky enough to lay eyes on a mermaid, likely an Eskimo woman in her kayak. During his 3rd voyage in 1609, he discovered a strait and bay that now bear his name, but his crew marooned him, and he was never heard from again. He had previously served the Dutch and guided them to the river that now bears his name, where New York City now stands. The English exploration in the north was temporarily halted by William Baffin's 1615 voyage, which led to the discovery of the land that bears his name, as well as many islands to the north of America. Meanwhile, the Dutch also participated in the exploration of the north. They had revolted against the despotism of Philip II, who was now the monarch of both Spain and Portugal. At first they tried to avoid conflict with their former rulers, and in 3 voyages between 1594 and 1597, William Barentz attempted to find the Northeast Passage under the auspices of the States General. He discovered Cherry Island and touched on Spitzbergen, but failed to find the main objective of his search. Afterward, the Dutch focused on seizing the Portuguese route instead of finding a new one for themselves. The reason they were able to do this is a curious example of history's nemesis. Due to the careful series of intermarriages planned by Ferdinand of Aragon, the Portuguese crown and all its possessions became joined to Spain in 1580 under Philip II, just a year after the northern provinces of the Netherlands had renounced allegiance to Spain. As a result, the Dutch were free to attack not only Spanish vessels and colonies, but also those previously belonging to Portugal. As early as 1596, Cornelius de Houtman rounded the Cape and visited Sumatra and Bantam, and within 50 years, the Dutch had replaced the Portuguese in many of their eastern possessions. They took Malacca in 1614, and, with it, the command of the Spice Islands. By 1658, they had full possession of Ceylon, now Sri Lanka. Much earlier, in 1619, they founded Batavia in Java, which became the center of their East Indian possessions. In the early days, the English sought to follow in the footsteps of the Dutch with regards to their East Indian policy. Queen Elizabeth established the English East India Company in 1600, and by 1619 they had already managed to secure a third of the profits from the Spice Islands after pressuring the Dutch. To achieve this, several English planters settled in Amboina, but within 4 years, trade rivalries had escalated to the point where the Dutch killed some of these merchants and drove the rest away from the islands. As a result, the English company shifted their focus to the mainland of India, where they quickly gained control of Madras and Bombay, leaving the Dutch in control of the islands in the Indian Ocean. We will later see how this impacted the history of geography, as it was due to their control of the East India Islands that the Dutch were essentially the ones who discovered Australia. In 1651 they established a colony at the Cape of Good Hope, which only fell into English hands during the Napoleonic Wars, when Napoleon held Holland. Meanwhile, the English had not forgotten about the potential of the Northeast Passage, either as a means of reaching the Spice Islands or as a way to tap into the overland route to China, which had previously been monopolized by the Genoese. In 1558, an English gentleman named Anthony Jenkinson was sent as an ambassador to the Tsar of Muscovy and travelled from Moscow as far as Bokhara. However, his venture was not very successful, and for some time England had to rely on Venetian ships to bring Indian and Chinese goods to their shores. But eventually they saw no reason why they couldn't establish direct relations with the East. In 1583, a company of Levant merchants was formed to open up direct communication with Aleppo, Baghdad, Ormuz, and Goa. They were unsuccessful in the latter two places due to Portuguese jealousy, but they managed to secure cheaper transit of Eastern goods to England. In 1587, the last Venetian ship, a massive vessel of 1,100 tons, was wrecked off the Isle of Wight. From then on, the English conducted their own business with the East, and the Venetian and Portuguese monopoly came to an end. The expeditions of Chancellor and Jenkinson to the court of Moscow in the 16th century had profound effects. The Russians were inspired to consider utilizing their proximity to one of the most well-known routes to the Far East. After Jenkinson's visit, Ivan the Terrible began extending his dominions eastward, sending troops to accompany the Russian merchant Stroganov in search of sables. Among the troops were 6,000 Cossacks commanded by Vasily Yermak, who found the Tatars an easy target. Yermak initially aimed to establish a new kingdom for himself, and in 1579 he successfully overcame the Tatars and their chief town, Sibir, near Tobolsk. However, he found it challenging to retain his position and decided to return to his allegiance to the Tsar on the condition of being supported. This was granted, and from that time on the Russians steadily pushed through the unknown territory of the north of Asia, which was named after the little town conquered by Yermak, of which barely any traces remain today. As early as 1639, they had reached the Pacific under Kupilov. In 1643, a force was sent from Yakutsk on the Lena, which reached the Amur, and thus the Russians came into contact with the Chinese for the first time, obtaining a new method of reaching Cathay. Geography gained knowledge of the extent of northern Asia. At about the same time, in 1648, the Arctic Ocean was reached on the north shores of Siberia. A fleet under the Cossack Dyshenev sailed from Kolyma and reached as far as the straits known as Bering. However, it was not until 50 years later, in 1696, that the Russians reached Kamchatka. Despite the knowledge gained by these successive bold pushes towards the north and east, it remained uncertain whether Siberia joined the northern part of the New World discovered by Columbus and Amerigo. In 1728, Peter the Great sent out an expedition under Vitus Bering, a Dane in the Russian service, with the express aim of ascertaining this point. He arrived in Kamchatka and constructed 2 ships as instructed by the Tsar, then set out on his voyage northward, hugging the coastline. When he reached just beyond 67 degrees north, he saw no land to the north or east, and assumed he had reached the end of the continent. In reality, he was only 30 miles from the west coast of America, but he was content with solving the specific problem given to him by the Tsar. The strait he discovered, although he did not realize it was a strait, has since been named after him. In 1741, Bering embarked on another voyage of discovery to determine how far east America extended. Within 2 weeks, he caught sight of the towering mountain he named Mount St. Elias. Bering himself died on this voyage, on an island also named after him. He had finally resolved the relationship between the Old and New Worlds. However, these voyages of Bering occurred much later in the discovery process than those previously discussed. His explorations were mainly for scientific purposes and to solve a scientific problem, whereas the Spanish, Portuguese, English, and Dutch were all focused on reaching the Spice Islands and Cathay. The Portuguese initially searched by slowly following the African coast, while the Spanish attempted to reach their destination via the western route, thanks to Columbus's bold idea. Under Magellan's even bolder conception, they succeeded in reaching their destination that way. The English and French sought a northwest passage to the Moluccas, while the English and Dutch tried a northeasterly route. However, the icy barrier of the north prevented success in both directions. It was only in the present century that the northwest passage was completed under McClure, and the northeast passage was completed by Nordenskjold, who sailed with entirely different motives than the mariners of England, France, and Holland, who first ventured within the Arctic Circle. The cumulative effect of Europe's various endeavours to seize the Venetians' stranglehold on eastern commerce was the revelation of a previously unknown continent separating the western coasts of Europe from the eastern coasts of Asia. How this newfound landmass was subsequently explored and claimed by European powers remains a mystery. Chapter 9. The Partition of America. In the early 16th century, the Spanish and Portuguese made discoveries along the coast of the New World. However, they soon began to explore the interior of the land. In 1513, Vasco Núñez de Balboa climbed the highest peak in the range running from the Isthmus of Panama. He saw the great ocean that would later be named the Pacific by Magellan. Balboa also heard about a golden country to the south that was inhabited by great nations. One of his companions, Francisco Pizarro, was destined to test this report. Diego Velázquez, the governor of Cuba, heard a similar report about a great nation to the north of Darien that possessed much gold. He sent his lieutenant, Hernando Cortés, in 1519 to investigate with 10 ships, 650 men, and 18 horses. When Cortés landed at the port named Vera Cruz, the natives of Mexico were astonished and alarmed by the appearance of his men and horses. Mexico was a large and semi-civilized state under the rule of Montezuma, the last representative of the Aztecs. The Aztecs had succeeded the Toltecs, who had settled on the Mexican tableland as early as the 7th century, introducing the use of metals, roads, and many elements of civilization. Montezuma was able to range no less than 200,000 men under his banners. He sent the Spaniards costly presents of gold, silver, and costly stuff. However, this only aroused the cupidity of Cortés, who decided to make a bold stroke for the conquest of such a rich prize. He burnt his ships and advanced into the interior of the country, conquering the tribe of the Tlaxcalans along the way. The Tlaxcalans had been at war with the Mexicans, but they were ready to assist Cortés against them after being conquered. With their aid, Cortés succeeded in seizing the Mexican king, who was forced to yield a huge tribute. After many struggles, Cortés found himself the master of the capital and all the resources of the Mexican Empire in 1521. He wasted no time in presenting his spoils to Emperor Charles V, who promptly appointed him governor and captain general of Mexico. This pattern of behavior was common among the New World's conquerors. They never considered establishing their own empires. This is a testament to the power of national identity, even among the most lawless individuals. As a result, European ideas were brought over to America, and the New World became subservient to Europe. Once Cortés had secured his position, he organized expeditions to explore the land. He personally traveled over 1,000 miles to reach Honduras, guided only by a map on cotton cloth that depicted all the towns, rivers, and mountains of the region up to Nicaragua. He also dispatched a small fleet to support a Spanish expedition that had been sent to the Moluccas under Sebastián del Cano. The fleet arrived at Tidor in 1527, shocking both Spanish and Portuguese when they learned it had set out from New Castile. In 1536, Cortés, who had lost much of his power, led an expedition by sea along Mexico's northwest coast and discovered what he believed to be a great island. He identified it with a mythical island in the Far East, near the terrestrial paradise known as California in a contemporary romance. Thanks to Cortés, almost all of Central America was explored before his death in 1540. Similarly, Ponce de León believed he had found a great island in Florida in 1512 while searching for Bayuca, a legendary island of the Indians that supposedly contained a fountain of youth. During Cortés's first attempt on Mexico, Pineda had sailed around Florida and connected it to the rest of the Mexican coast, which he traveled as far as Vera Cruz. The deeds of Cortés were of utmost importance in their impact. He had demonstrated how easily a small group of men could vanquish an empire and amass unparalleled wealth. Francisco Pizarro, inspired by Cortez's success, set out to discover the fabled El Dorado that he had heard about during Balboa's expedition. Accompanied by Diego de Almagro, he embarked on several coastal expeditions along the northwest coast of South America, where they learned of the Inca Empire on the plateau of Peru. They also acquired enough gold and silver to raise their expectations of the country's riches and returned to Spain to report to the emperor. Pizarro secured permission from Charles V to attempt the conquest of Peru, and he was appointed governor and captain general, with the condition of paying a tribute of 1/5 of the treasure he might obtain. In February 1531, he set out with a small force of 180 men, including 36 horsemen, and adopted Cortez's strategy by heading straight for the capital, Cuzco. There they captured Atahualpa, the reigning Inca. Atahualpa attempted to ransom himself by filling the room in which he was confined, measuring 22 feet long by 16 wide, with gold bars as high as the hand could reach. He fulfilled this colossal promise, and Pizarro's companions found themselves in possession of booty worth 3 million sterling. However, Atahualpa was not released, but was instead condemned to death on a frivolous pretext. Pizarro dismissed his followers, confident that the wealth they had taken would attract as many men as he could desire to El Dorado. He settled in Lima, near the coast, in 1534. Meanwhile, Almagro had been sent south and had become the master of Chile. In 1539, Pizarro's brother Gonzales led another expedition across the Andes, reaching the sources of the Amazon, which one of his companions, Francisco de Orellana, navigated all the way to its mouth. He arrived there in August 1541, after a voyage of 1,000 leagues. The river was named after Orellana, but based on his reports of a tribe of female warriors, it became known as the River of the Amazons. Reports of a new El Dorado to the north spread like wildfire, with rumors of temple roofs covered in gold. This tantalizing tale would later lead Sir Walter Raleigh on a disastrous expedition to Guiana. Meanwhile, Orellana's voyage had connected the Spanish and Portuguese spheres of influence in the new world of Amerigo. By 1540, Spanish adventurers had already mapped out the main outlines of Central and South America, as well as some of the interior, within half a century of Columbus's first voyage. Thanks to a papal bull, Portugal had laid claim to Brazil, but the rest of the vast country was under Spanish rule. The Portuguese wisely treated Brazil as an outlet for their overflowing population, which settled there in large numbers and established plantations. The Spaniards, on the other hand, saw their vast holdings as exclusive markets to be visited only by them. Rich mines of gold, silver, and mercury were discovered in Mexico and Peru, particularly in the famous mines of Potosi. These were exploited solely for the benefit of Spain, which acted as a sieve, pouring precious metals into Europe and driving up prices throughout the Old World. In return, European merchandise was sent on the return voyages of Spanish galleons to New Spain. However, the Spaniards could only buy Flemish cloth, for example, through Spanish intermediaries, who raised its price to 3 times the original cost. This short-sighted policy on the part of Spain naturally encouraged smuggling and attracted the ships of all nations to that pursuit. While the French and English had made initial attempts to explore the northeast coast of North America, very little was done to settle on such inhospitable shores, which did not offer the rich prizes that tropical America afforded. Neither Cartier's exploration in 1534, nor the Cabot's much earlier journey led to any attempt to claim the land. Breton fishermen visited the fisheries off Newfoundland, and various explorers attempted to find openings that would give them a northwest passage. But otherwise, the more northerly part of the continent was left unoccupied until the beginning of the 17th century. In 1565, the first settlement was established in the town of St. Augustine, located in the land of Florida. However, this town was destroyed 3 years later by a French expedition. Sir Walter Raleigh made an attempt to establish a colony in 1584 near the area where Virginia now stands, but it failed after 3 years. It was not until the reign of James I that an organized effort was made by England to establish plantations, which were then known as colonies, on the North American coast. In 1606, 2 chartered companies were founded, the Plymouth Company to the north and the London Company to the south. These companies nominally divided the coast from Nova Scotia to Florida. Throughout the 17th century, these large tracts of land were slowly divided into smaller states, mainly Puritan in the north, New England, and High Church and Catholic in the south, Virginia and Maryland. However, between the two, and on the banks of the Hudson and the Delaware, two other European nations had also established colonies. The Dutch formed the New Netherlands along the Hudson in 1609, and the Swedes formed New Sweden along the Delaware in 1636. Unfortunately, the latter only lasted a few years, and was absorbed by the Dutch in 1655. The capital of New Netherlands was established on Manhattan Island, south of the palisade still known as today as Wall Street, and the city was named New Amsterdam. The Hudson River is a vital artery of commerce between the Atlantic and the Great Lakes, and this wedge between the two sets of English colonies would have been a hindrance to any future progress. This was recognized by Charles II, who in 1664 dispatched an expedition to demand the surrender of New Amsterdam, even though England and Holland were at peace. New Amsterdam was taken and renamed New York after the king's brother, the Duke of York, who later became James II. New Sweden, which fell into English hands at the same time, was sold as a proprietary plantation to a Jersey man, Sir George Carteret, and a Quaker, William Penn. By this somewhat high-handed procedure, the entire coastline down to Florida was in English hands. In the year 1607, both the London and Plymouth companies began forming plantations in America. It was during this same year that the French established their first effective settlements at Port Royal and Nova Scotia, which was then called Acadie. The following year, Samuel de Champlain founded French Canada and established settlements along the St. Lawrence River. Champlain explored the lake country and confined French activity to the banks of the St. Lawrence. The warlike Five Nations of the Iroquois Indians roamed between the French and English settlements, and Champlain was forced to make the Iroquois the enemies of France, which had significant effects on the final struggle between England and France in the 18th century. The French continued to explore the interior of the continent, and in 1673 Marquette discovered the Mississippi River and descended it as far as the mouth of the Arkansas. However, it was Robert de La Salle who undertook the work of exploring the Mississippi Valley. He had already discovered the Ohio and Illinois rivers, and in 3 expeditions between 1680 and 1682 succeeded in working his way right down to the mouth of the Mississippi. He named the huge tract of country he traversed Louisiana after Louis XIV. From that point on, France claimed the entire hinterland of North America, while the English were confined to the relatively narrow strip of country east of the Allegheny Mountain Range. New Orleans was founded at the mouth of the Mississippi in 1716 and named after the Prince Regent. French activity ranged between Quebec and New Orleans, leaving many traces even to the present day, in French names like Mobile, Detroit, and others throughout the intervening country. The situation at the beginning of the 18th century was remarkably similar to that of the Gold Coast in Africa at the end of the 19th century. The French persistently attempted to encroach upon the English sphere of influence, and it was in attempting to define the two spheres that George Washington learned his first lesson in diplomacy and strategy. The colonies of France and England in America were in a near constant state of war, fighting for control of the land where Pittsburgh now stands. This land was seen as the gateway to the West, as it overlooked the Ohio Valley. Duquesne, a Frenchman, founded a fort there, which was named after him. It wasn't until 1758 that the English finally took control of the fort from the French. The following year, Wolfe captured Quebec, which led to the downfall of French power in North America. Throughout the long conflict, the English were greatly aided by the guerrilla tactics of the Iroquois against the French. In 1763, the Treaty of Paris was signed, which ceded all of French America to England. Spain also gave Florida to England in exchange for the Philippines, which were captured during the war. As compensation, all the land west of the Mississippi became part of Spain's possessions in Mexico. This land was later sold to the United States by Napoleon in 1803, which removed any barriers to the westward expansion of the United States. In 1670, a chartered company was formed with Prince Rupert at its head. Its purpose was to trade with the Indians for fur in Hudson's Bay, which was then called Rupert's Land. The Hudson Bay Company gradually expanded its knowledge of the northern parts of America towards the Rocky Mountains. However, it wasn't until 1740 that Varennes de la Vérendrye discovered the extent of the mountains. Between 1769 to 71, a fur trader named Hearne traced the Coppermine River to the sea. It wasn't until 1793 that Mr. Alexander Mackenzie, later Sir A., discovered the river that now bears his name and crossed the continent of North America from the Atlantic to the Pacific. One of the reasons for the late exploration of the northwest of North America was a geographical myth started by a Spanish voyager named Juan de Fuca in 1592. Coasting as far as Vancouver Island, he entered the inlet to the south of it. Not being able to see land to the north, he reported that a huge sea spread over all that part of the country. Most geographers assumed that this sea passed over into Hudson Bay, or the surrounding area. It was this report that encouraged hopes of finding the Northwest Passage in a latitude low enough to be free from ice.